Hello and welcome to week 11. For this week, we are going to focus on creative development and also review observation and assessment technique number 6, for which we're going to cover checklists, rating scales, and rubrics. So let's get into the class agenda and start off with what we are going to be covering. So we're going to first talk about creative development and what that entails. Then we're going to address a little bit about what you should be focusing on for your case study regarding your focal child. And most of you are going to continue working with your focal child. So we're going to try to identify your focal child's disposition and their temperament. We're also going to look at the observation and assessment technique number 6, specifically looking at what checklists, rating scales, and rubrics are, and we're going to do some exercises or activities around those. And then I'm going to cover what the homework is for next week, which is week 12. Okay, so creative development. When we talk about creativity, we're talking about a capacity, a cognitive capacity that we have, and we're going to be focusing on the child, viewing creativity and creative development or creative capacity for children. So it's the capacity that children have to represent the world around them through expressions that can be considered artistic. So it's using artistic means or artistic capabilities to be able to represent abstractly what the world around them is, or how they interpret and understand the world around them. So we have here a definition of creativity by Leggett from 2017, and here we see that creativity for young children is going to involve different cognitive processes. As I said before, creativity is a cognitive skill, or if you look at cognitive development, creativity is going to show up as a cognitive skill under this particular area of development. So it involves several cognitive processes, and it is going to develop through social interactions, through play, and through imagination, and the promotion or support of the development of imagination. So creative thinking is going to be a transformative activity that is going to lead the child to new ways of thinking and doing that are novel or new, and that potentially can be useful for the community in which the child is involved. So if we look here to the right at this creativity cycle, we see that, and we're going to start over to the right, top right, where it says dispositions. And we see that in order for the child to be creative, there's certain dispositions that need to be in place. And these dispositions can also be termed cognitive processes. So curiosity, intrinsic motivation, and interest are going to be dispositions that the child needs in order to be involved or engaged in a creative process. So you might think, well, what happens if the children don't have these dispositions? If they're not curious, or they don't have this motivation, or they're not interested? That doesn't mean that, and it can definitely be possible that the child doesn't have these dispositions naturally. That doesn't mean that the child can't be prompted or supported in order to be develop creativity. You can definitely provide activities, provide materials that are going to raise the child's levels of curiosity and interest, and that are going to help the child be motivated to be able to be engaged in these in the activity that you're offering them. So, but you need these dispositions, and once these dispositions are available, be it that the child brings them naturally or that you have helped enhance and support them, then the creative process begins. So the imagination is exalted. The child might have insights, might have examples of divergent thinking that they're sharing. They can do problem solving. They can engage in activities that have aesthetic and beauty related, where they have to appreciate beauty in the activity itself. So that's going to entail the creative process. When all of these different processes are happening, that you can define as the creative process. And then after the creative process, there usually is a product. So the productivity level or step of this cycle is when the actual product comes to be. So there's convergent thinking here instead of the divergent thinking that happened in the creative process step. In the productivity, it's a convergent thinking process or a synthesis process that is characterized by being original and novel. So it's a new, different way of viewing a situation, addressing a situation, understanding a situation, solving or resolving a situation, and that's going to make it be creative. The fact that it is new, it can't just be different. It needs to be new and original in order to be a creative product. And then that sums up, if we look at this cycle here that starts here in the dispositions, goes through the creative process, ends in that productivity, then that is what involves creativity itself. That is defined here as the ability to produce works that are novel and appropriately or useful for society or for the community that the children are involved in. Okay, so definitely you can help the child develop creativity. So again, we're not going to think of the child as either having or not having creativity, but more so as having the potential to have that aspect of their cognitive development enhanced by you, by the environment, by the activities and the interactions that the child engages in at school. Okay, so let's think about now your focal child. Let's think about the dispositions of the temperament, which is something that you need to be focusing on for week 11. So we're going to write some dispositions and temperaments that your focal child has. That's what you're going to be focusing on. So what are dispositions? Dispositions are going to be inherent qualities of mind and character that are inherent to the child. So you're going to be observing the child and trying to identify aspects or qualities of their mind, of the way they think, and their character, of the way they interact with others, that are particular to them and that you can consider dispositions. So some examples are when the child displays courage or curiosity for learning, when the child trusts others or has a playful attitude or approach to other children, when the child perseveres in something that is difficult or challenging for them, when they display confidence and display levels of responsibility in the activities or the experiences that they're engaged in. So we're going to see the disposition, and they can be different. Each child can have dispositions that are more salient than others. And so that's going to be your task, to be able to identify in your particular focal child what the dispositions are, the most salient ones are. So look at your observations that you've done of your focal child so far and the experiences that you had with your focal child, and try to identify some behaviors that are going to lead you to conclude, okay, these are the dispositions that are behind these particular behaviors, and thus these are some that I can identify for my focal child. So dispositions are going to be made evident by observable behaviors. Like, for example, taking interest in a lesson, or being involved, or persisting on a difficult task, or posing questions and challenges to assertions that you or the adults or that their peers make, being calm in the face of uncertainty, or expressing points of view. So those are all examples of behaviors that you might observe that then can take you to the next step, that would be to say, okay, well, my child is courageous, or my child is curious, or he or she is trusting, or responsible, because of some of these behaviors that you have observed. So that's what entails, or what entails to dispositions, right? So temperament is a little bit different than dispositions, because it is the tendency in which a child responds to a stimuli. So it is said that it's the child's nature, right? Because it's the tendency, the most frequent tendency that they have to respond to certain stimuli in terms of the behavior, style that they enact, or the way that they just respond, the characteristics of the way in which they respond to stimuli. And typically we have three types of temperament, which are easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. We're going to explain a little bit more about them here in this next slide. So a child that has an easy temperament is generally a child that is positive, that is in a good mood, that quickly establishes regular routines in infancy. So if we're looking at a baby or an infant, and that adapts easily to new experiences and changes. For example, if there's a change in the routine, in the daily schedule, or if there's a new person coming into the classroom, a new friend joining the group, or a new teacher has come, or a teacher has left, and any type of changes that for the child can be conceived big, disruptive kind of changes to their day-to-day routine, a child that has an easy temperament would react in a positive way to that and would adapt quite quickly. On the contrary, a child who has a difficult temperament would not adapt quickly and would react negatively to those kinds of changes in routine, or in personnel, or in friends, or things, for example, that happen at home. That child would probably cry frequently, would engage in, would be slow to engage in changes in the routine, would be slow to accept new experiences, if at all, and would be a child that would just have difficulties, and it would be hard for them to adapt to changes. A slow to warm up temperament child would have a low activity level and would have perhaps a negative, or a not noticeable. If it's not negative, it might just not be noticeable, the reactions that they have to changes. They do adapt, but they're slow to adapt. So they're not going to adapt as quickly as an easy temperament child would, but they're not also going to present so much of a negative kind of behavior as a difficult temperament child. So if we look at this chart here, this table here on the right, we see that there are other descriptors that we could use to talk about temperament, because other authors also talk about emotion ability, emotionality, sociability, and activity levels in terms to aspects to take into account to be able to identify temperament. So here in this table, you see that these are all different criteria that can be used, and this is the description of what each of those criteria signify. And then a child with an easy temperament or a difficult temperament or a slow to start temperament would react in these ways that are highlighted here in each of these situations. And we here see that accessibility is defined as ease of approaching new people and situations. So this is the same as sociability over here on the left. And then descriptive expressions are degree of affect when pleased, displeased, happy, or sad. And this mood swings are degrees of positive or negative effect. These two would be akin to emotionality, right? So the child's emotionality could be observed by these two criteria. This criterion of accessibility corresponds to sociability, and then the activity level is the same as the activity level in this definition. So you can see if your child has a high level of activity, it might be an indicator of a difficult temperament. If the child has a low level of activity, that might be an indicator that the child has a slow to warm up temperament, and so on. So use this chart or this table to help you identify what the temperament of your child is. And then once you have done that, then you've completed sort of the task of this week, which is to identify the child's temperament and to identify some of the dispositions that the child might have based on the observations that you've done of your focal child. So I hope that helps you to complete that aspect of the case study. So let's move on to observation and assessment technique number 6, which are several. So we said we were going to talk about checklists, we're talking about rating scales, and rubrics. So checklists are going to be instruments that we use, and all of these are instruments that we use to record knowledge, to record a skill, to record a type of behavior or an attitude that the child has or not attained. So in a checklist, we only have a dual response. So we only have this divergent kind of response to each of these knowledge, skills, behaviors, or attitudes that we're observing. So it's either going to be that the child attained it or did not, or it's present in the child or it's not present. So it's a yes or no kind of observation or assessment tool. And these both could use for observations or could be used for assessment. And here you have some examples of checklists. So you'll see that you have the skills that you want to observe, and then you have if it's present or not. And you can have something like this where you have the name of the child, and then you're looking at all the different skills, and then just see where check to see if it's present or not present. Or you can have something like this where you can have all the names of all the children in your class here, down here. So you would have the entire roster in this first column, and then in the top columns you would have, or in the top row in each column, you would have a skill that you want to observe. So you want to know, for example, if they do one-to-one correspondence when they count. You want to know, for example, if they can recite all the letters of the alphabet. You want to know if they can count up to 10. You want to know if they can jump with both feet, or they can hop on both, alternating both feet. And you have all these different skills here identified on the top row in each of the different columns. And then what you're going to do, because you have the roster and the names of all the children here, is you're just going to check. And you can use a check mark to say, indicate that it's present, or an X to represent that it's not present. And that's all that a checklist is going to allow you to do, to document and register in a checklist if a skill, an attitude, a behavior is or is not present currently in the moment that you observe it for the child. This is another checklist, and it's designed differently, and it's per child. So you would have one of these for each children in your class, and you just have the name of the child, the level or the age. You always need to date these because this is going to change. You can use this same checklist, this one in particular, in different moments of the year, and you'll get different results when you apply it, because the child is going to be learning and know different skills and be mastering different skills and different behaviors and different knowledge base. So you can do this, say, at the beginning of the year and see which letters does the child recognize, which numbers does the child recognize, which shapes does the child recognize, and so on. And just mark with a check mark or with an X the ones that he or she does and the ones that he or she does not. And then use this same blank checklist, say 2 or 3 months from that time, and observe again these same skills and compare and see growth. So checklists are going to help you take down observations, and they're also going to help you assess all of these, because they're just instruments to document. And then what you do with that data, what you do with the information that you collect through these instruments, is what is going to be considered either an observation or an assessment. So there is a activity sheet under week 1. So I'm gonna ask you to pause this video right here and look for that sheet and have it with you as you continue watching this recording. Okay, so you should be back with your activity sheet that you downloaded from week 11. In that activity sheet, you'll see that activity 1 is asking you to think about 3 skills that you would want to observe in your focal child. And we can still focus on your focal child, although we're not necessarily going to use this with your focal child right now. But think about your focal child, identify 3 skills in your checklist, and do that, and then continue with this presentation. Okay, so now that you have done that, and have done an exercise on checklists, let's look at rating scales. So rating scales are going to be similar to checklists, but instead of gauging if the behavior or skill is present or not present, you're going to be rating the extent to which the behavior or the skill is present. So you can have a numerical scale. So you can say, okay, this behavior is present up to level 5 or level 2 or level 3 or 10, if 10 is your top or your max points in your scale. Or you can have a rating scale that is more qualitative, that has different levels. Like, for example, here, unsatisfactory, below average, average, above average, and outstanding, right? So this one over here, you have different levels, but each of those levels is qualified by a qualitative measure that is going to indicate what that level stands for. So you can still, if we look over here, you can still have a list of skills and behaviors that you want to observe in a particular child at a particular time. But instead of saying yes or no, or present or not present, you're looking at the level of the skill or behavior, to what extent that skill or behavior is present for that particular child. There are graphic rating scales, as you see this one here in the middle, where you have smiley faces and sad faces and all the in-between faces that are going to give you options. Usually we use these graphic rating scales for self-assessment. So we're going to give that rating scale to the child and ask the child to tell us to what level are they hurting, right? So if you're not hurting at all, you're happy. If you're hurting to the max extent, then you're 10, you're crying. If you're somewhere in the middle, right? So you would explain, for a self-assessment, you would explain the rating scale to the child and ask them to point to the one that best represents what they are feeling. And there are different examples of graphic rating scales that are used in different types of studies to be able to gauge what the child's response is, because the child is not necessarily going to understand these qualitative answers: unsatisfactory, below average, average, above average, outstanding. So, but they are going to be able to identify with the pictures how they feel. So these are mainly used, the graphic rating scales are mainly used with children to help them respond to a question that we're asking. And teachers can use these researchers use these a lot, but teachers can also use this in the classroom to ask children when they want children's feedback on something. You can also use this to help them evaluate their portfolios and their work. So how satisfied are you with the work that you've completed? And give them these graphic rating skills to help them respond to those questions. Okay, so if we look at your activity sheet, activity 2 is going to be to turn your checklist into a rating scale. So you can take the same skills that you identified before in your checklist in activity 1 and now do perhaps a 3-point numerical scale. And what would it mean to not meet, develop, or meet that particular skill? And you can do not met, developing, met, or you can do what we had before here, the unsatisfactory, below average, average, above average, outstanding, or any scale that you come up with. So I'm going to ask you to pause this video again and complete your rating scale, turn in your checklist into a rating scale. Okay, so now that you have had experience with doing rating checklists and rating scales, we're going to look at rubrics. So rubrics are another instrument that are used mainly to assess, but you can use them to observe as well. Again, all of these are instruments to record and document what you're observing in the children. What you do with that afterwards, if you decide to give that a grade or to use that for assessment purposes, that would be using that instrument for assessment. If you're just compiling them and compiling the information and recording them using a checklist, a rating scale, or a rubric, just to give you information about the child, then it would be an observation tool because you're not necessarily evaluating with the information that you're obtaining. So the rubrics are going to be an instrument that is going to be designed also to observe or assess knowledge, skills, or attitudes and behaviors. And they're going to focus on criteria. So different criterion that you are going to select. You're going to select different aspects of development that you want to identify. And then you're going to create levels of performance for each of them, like the rating scale. But you're going to describe what each level of performance looks like. So if my criterion that I'm using is the child is able to count up to 10, maybe level 1 is going to be the child can count up to 3. Level 2 is going to be the child can count up to 5. Level 3 is the child is able to count up to 7. And level 4 would be attaining that criterion that I identify, so the child is able to count up to 10, perhaps with no help, right? With no help from the teacher or from adults. So each of those levels are going to be steps toward attaining the skill that I have identified. And here what we talk about is we talk about different criteria that you're going to identify in your rubric, and then each of those criteria are going to be in that first column of the rubric, and all of these are different examples of rubrics, right? So each of these, the first column is going to have the criteria that you have selected that you want to assess, right? And I'll show you these three in a moment because these are different. But the way that we design a rubric typically is the first column is the criteria that you have identified, and the subsequent columns are each of the levels of performance that are going to be evidenced by the child, so that you can say that the child, regarding this particular criterion, performs at level 1 or level 2 or level 3 or level 4. You can have more than 4 levels. You can have 3 levels, but usually it's 3 or more. And a lot of cases you see between 3 and 4 levels of performance. So here you have a similar type of rubric as the problem-solving rubric. This blog post rubric has the same. The first column is the different criteria that you're assessing, and then level 1, level 2, and level 3. Here, instead of saying instead of calling them 1, 2, 3, they have different qualitative indicators of levels of performance. So the levels are named, they have a name to them. So going back to these rubrics here and this one over here, they're different because they have identified the skill on top, and then the first column has the levels from 1 to 4, and then the explanation of what each of those levels looks like in terms of what you're expecting the child to do to be able to be in level 4, 3, 2, or 1. And this one also seems to be in a reverse order, right? So level 1 would be the highest versus level 4 would be the lowest. You can do them as you will. It can be that you would have this reversed, and that the level 1 would be attaining the skill, and level 4 would be the one that's farthest from attaining the skill. But you can organize them however you want. Here you can see that this one is a rubric for self-assessment, because it has this graphic identifier here for children, and to have them see if they did some of the things that were required of them, or they did all of the things that were required on them. So here it looks like they were asked to write their name accurately on their paper, right? So the first level would be they used capitals and periods. They put finger spaces between the words. They spelled sight words correctly. They wrote in a neat way and tried their best, and then they wrote their name on their paper. So this actually looks like not like the command of the teacher was to write their name on the paper, but it was to write a paper. And these are all different aspects that they needed to include in their paper. If they included all of these aspects, they're going to give themselves a smiley face with a little party hat. If they didn't, this is what they're getting for each of the things that they did incorporate. So if they only use capitals and periods, they would be here on this sort of level 1. And if they did everything and included their name on their paper, then they get this level, the last level, or level 5. That would be the child, the smiley face with the hat on top. So again, this is one that would be really easy for the children to use for self-assessment of their work. And these would be more ones that teachers would use to observe and assess the children. So you can look at these in more detail. There is a non-narrated PowerPoint as well that you can open up and look at these in more detail if you want to really read through each of the definitions of the rubric. There is a website that I have here, Ruby Star, which is a really good website to compose and download rubrics from. And they're rubrics made by teachers and for teachers. So it would be a really good one to check out in terms of rubrics. So the activity 3 that we're going to do for rubrics is actually the activity that is going to be your discussion board activity for this week. So I have randomly assigned you to a small group, and within that small group you are asked to select an area of development in a concept. So for example, you can select from the area of development of cognitive development, you can select the concept of number. And then once you have identified your area of development and your concept that you want to work with, then develop a rubric with the criteria that you want to assess. And for example, several, so at least 3 different criteria that you want to assess. So for this example, if I'm looking at the concept of number, I might want to identify, I might want to know if the child identifies numbers by pointing, if the child can name numbers up to 10, if the child uses one-to-one correspondence to count, and so on, right? So I have those 3 criteria and I would put them here in my first column. So here I would write identify numbers by pointing, here I would write names numbers up to 10, and in the third one I would write uses one-to-one correspondence to count. And then I would develop 4 levels of mastery per criterion. So if level of mastery is 4, then here I would say the child can definitely identify numbers by pointing. The child here can name numbers up to 10. The child here uses one-to-one correspondence every time they count any object, right? That would be my level 4, or my highest level of performance. And then I would write what level 3 looks like for identifies numbers by pointings, what number 3 looks like for names numbers up to 10, and for uses one-to-one correspondence. And then I would describe what level 2 and what level 1 looks like. So here we're using numbers that go from 1 to 4, where 4 is the highest level of performance and 1 is the lowest level of performance. So the farthest one from the actual criteria that I'm going to want to observe in the children. So you're going to do that by groups. And once you have decided, okay, these are the criteria this is the area of development, this is the concept, these are the different criteria, and these are the definitions of each of the levels of performance for each of the criteria, then you're going to have one person from your group post that onto the discussion board. So there's going to be 5 groups, 3 groups of 3 and 2 groups of 4. So find your small group, discuss and identify your development area, your concept, develop your rubric, and have one person post it. And then there's going to end up being after each group posts, there are going to be 5 posts, 1 per group. So you're going to collaborate with your group to create your 1 post, have 1 person post it. Not all 3 or 4 members of the group need to post, just 1 person per group is going to post. And then you individually are going to go into another group's rubric and read it and provide feedback for them in a post. So there's 2 elements of work this week. 1 is in your small group, but 1 is you on your own individually commenting on other groups' work. Okay, so that's it. These are the references that were used for this presentation, and you're going to find some of this work in your under week 4. So in the same place that you found the activity to do with this presentation, you're going to find a article on temperament that explains a little bit more about temperament. You're going to find a article on creative thinking if you want to go further into reading and understanding the creative cycle. And then there are 2 developmental checklist PDFs that are going to have several examples of checklists for observing and assessing development that I think are going to be very useful for you. So check those out. They're under the content area for week 11. Okay, so the homework for week 12 is you're going to read from your Assessment in Early Childhood Education book by Worthman and Harding. You're going to read chapter 10 if you're using the 2016 version, or you're going to read chapter 11 if you're using the new 2020 edition of that book. You're going to complete the discussions on activities on Blackboard, and you're going to work on your case study, A Focal Child. So for week 12, we're going to write about the child's interest and preferences, but we're going to get to that when we get to week 12. So this is what's coming up for the following week. But for this week, we're concentrating on writing rubrics and developing the rubric for the discussion board. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and either through the discussion board that has a Q&A section on Blackboard or via email. I hope you have a good week.